law and order was falling to pieces. Justice was a joke. People were making their own rules. So it's no wonder that Habakkuk asked God, how long is this going to take? Habakkuk wanted to know why all these things were happening. Why were innocent people suffering while the wicked were getting away with murder? The ancient prophet asked many of the same questions we all keep asking, and it seemed as though God was silent. There were no answers or explanations from God. Through all these terrible times, God remained silent. But the prophet kept waiting and wondering, asking the same questions over and over. Finally, in desperation, Habakkuk climbs up a watchtower, figuring that maybe he'll be able to catch a glimpse of some sort of sign for God. And, as God would have it, God's voice comes through and says to the prophet, "Get out your pen and write this down. Write it down in big, bold letters so everyone can see it. Look out for the proud, the ones who are all puffed up and full of themselves because they don't have the right spirit. They will fall flat on their faces because their souls are empty. But the ones who have faith, who are willing to wait, the ones who haven't turned away from me, those people are in good standing with me. Those who are patient and wait, those who truly believe and have faith, are really alive and well." Sounds good, doesn't it? But with so much going on in our world today, it doesn't seem possible that eventually everything will be put right. Whenever we pick up a newspaper or watch the news, we hear about death and destruction, corruption, and selfishness. It seems as though our world is crashing in around on us and we have nowhere to go. We cry out to God as Habakkuk did so long ago, "How long, God? How much more do you expect us to take?" We have questions but no answers. God hasn't returned our calls. It's as if God has gone out to lunch and won't be getting back to us anytime soon. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in a faraway land, there was a king who ruled as righteously and lovingly as he knew how. To make sure his subjects were doing well, he disguised himself from time to time and travel among them. That way, people would not put on a false front. One evening, the king appeared to notice a house with open doors and windows in which a man was singing with great volume while he was eating dinner. The king knocked on the door and asked if he might come in. "Please come in," the man said. "A guest is a gift from God." As the disguised king ate, he asked the man about his occupation. The man replied, "I'm a cobbler. I repair shoes. The Lord blesses me with some coins every day, and so I have enough to eat, and for that I give thanks." "That's all you earn?" asked the king. "Just enough for one day? What about tomorrow?" "It's all in the hands of God," replied the cobbler. "God will provide." The king decided to test the cobbler. Is it possible that one can really trust God so much? The king wondered. "Tomorrow I'll pass a law forbidding shoe repair without a license. I'll see then if the cobbler really has so much faith." The next evening, the king returned to the cobbler's home. The cobbler with his cheerful self, the king asked him how his day had gone, to which the cobbler replied, "Our great king has proclaimed that a permit must be obtained in order to repair shoes. So today I helped people carry water from the town well to their homes. Those who could paid me, so I have enough to eat for dinner. Come and share it with me." "What will you do if you don't make any money tomorrow carrying water?" asked the king. "God will provide," the cobbler responded. The king then issued a rule that each his or her own water. When the disguised king returned to the cobbler's house that night, he asked how he had managed that day. I chopped wood today, and I sold the wood and bought this food, the faithful person responded. Tomorrow, if something happens, God will provide in another way. Well, as you can imagine, the next day the king issued a proclamation demanding that all woodcutters report to the palace to work. They worked all day, but they weren't paid anything. That evening, the cobbler turned woodcutter stopped at the pawn shop on the way home and pawned his sword. He bought food. He also carved a wooden blade for his sheep. That evening, the king came to visit again. He asked the cobbler what he would do if there was a sword inspection the next day. The man just gave his usual response, God will provide. The next morning, the cobbler was told that he was going to be the executioner of a prisoner. The cobbler protested that he could never do that, but the cobbler was told, you have no choice. As the prisoner knelt before him, the cobbler prayed in a loud voice, Almighty God, you know whether or not this man is guilty. You be his judge. If he's guilty, let my sword be sharp. If innocent, let this sword be made of wood. He grammatically drew the sword from its sheath, and all the people exclaimed, it's wooden, the prisoner is innocent. The king, who had set it all up and who watched from a distance, came forward to his friend and said, from now on, you will be my permanent guest. Now, what do you think of that? Wonderful, exclaimed the cobbler. God will provide. Our cobbler friend understood what it meant to live by faith. And in many ways, I think we could say that our friend Zacchaeus lived by faith as well. Now, for those of us who have grown up with Sunday school, vacation Bible school, and even church camp, we have all heard the story about Zacchaeus over and over again, right? Yep. So, if you check your bulletin, you will see the words to the song about Zacchaeus. You got it?
Yep.
Now, I've done this on purpose so that you won't hopelessly search your memory bank for the words while you're supposed to be listening to the rest of this sermon. It's a self-defense mechanism. Anyway, you come to understand that Zacchaeus wasn't especially tall, and that he was also one of those mean tax collectors we've heard so much about lately. You might remember that tax collectors were considered dirty, rotten scoundrels. Well, today we have another tax collector on our hands, and this one is named Zacchaeus. And he was in deep, deep trouble with the people around him. That's because Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. In other words, he was at the top of the heap as far as collecting taxes were concerned. You see, in those days, the chief tax collector was not only able to extract more money than taxes owed by someone, but Zacchaeus was also able to demand more money from the tax collectors he supervised. It was a sort of pyramid scheme, and our friend Zach was right there up on top. So it's no wonder that everybody hated Zach, and that he was considered to be a Roman collaborator and ritually unclean. And so due to his association with people who stood outside Jewish tradition. Now, as if all this tax collecting stuff wasn't bad enough, Zach had a height problem as well. In a world where most people weren't especially tall by our standards today, Zach was even shorter than most. And that just added insult Jesus. At this point, Jesus was the talk of the town wherever he went. Word was spreading that Jesus wasn't any ordinary teacher. Jesus was turning everything upside down by welcoming the lowest of the low in society. He seemed to love people like Zach, and so Zach just had to see Jesus for himself. Now, I don't know for sure, but maybe even at this point, Zach had faith that Jesus would be able to help Zach turn his life around. Certainly, after Jesus spotted Zach up in the tree and invited himself to Zach's house for dinner, Zach's life was forever changed. So, I have one more story for you. Okay, here we go. When Mr. Sanders turned the corner of 15th Street, he heard the music, although he could scarcely consider the banging of upturned empty plastic drums, metal garbage cans, and hollow construction pipes to be music. A crowd was gathered around the street performers. People tapped their feet and swayed rhythmically to the drumming. Some came forward and tossed money into a cardboard box. Mr. Sanders turned up his collar on his cashmere coat and crossed the street. As Mr. Sanders turned the corner, he paused to look up at the gleaming skyscraper that loomed over the block. The corners of his mouth twitched into what was almost a smile. He loved to turn this corner and see his building, 30 floors of steel and glass, reflecting the surrounding city and his own success. Focused on getting upstairs to his board meeting, Mr. Sanders stumbled over the outstretched feet of an old man sitting on the sidewalk. An angry hiss escaped his lips as he turned to look into the unshaven face of the homeless man. Mr. Sanders braced himself, expecting the old man to hold out an empty cup or to beg for spare change. Instead, the old man's yellowed eyes smiled and his mouth opened into a grin. There, stuck between stained teeth, was a white stick. A lollipop stick. The old man held out his hand and offered Mr. Sanders a cellophane-wrapped red lollipop. Surprised, Mr. Sanders found himself taking the lollipop and looking more closely into the old man's face. The old man nodded his head as though in answer, tilted his head back against the building, and closed his eyes. Mr. Sanders just stood there. Then he slowly turned and started back toward his building. As he walked, he looked down at the lollipop. He tore the wrapping off and stuck the cherry candy into his mouth. The lollipop colored his tongue bright red as he rolled it around in his mouth, just as he'd done when he was a child. He pulled the lollipop out and held it up to the light. The world turned on a red glow, coloring the street, people, and his building. He popped it back into his mouth and smiled. Mr. Sanders pushed through the heavy doors of the conference room. The 8 waiting executives sat up and flipped open their folders spread around the table. The man on Mr. Sanders' right cleared his throat and began, "We're progressing on schedule. The last of the residents will be bought out and moved out from the blocks between Linwood and Allen Streets by the end of the week. Our contact on the zoning board assures me we won't have any problems." Mr. Sanders interrupted. "Did you know there's a lake back in the woods behind the old grocery store on Allen?" Surprised, the young man looked up from his notes and hesitated. "Yes, sir, Bear Lake. The lake will be drained in the spring, will be diverted for use as irrigation for landscaping around the complex." As the young man was about to continue his presentation, Mr. Sanders interrupted him again. "My father and I used to fish in that lake. Did you know that?" The young man replied, "No, sir, I didn't know it." "Well, We fished down there most Sunday afternoons in the spring and fall. Anything we caught, my mother would fry up for dinner. Mr. Sanders asked, "Do you fish, Jason?" "No, sir, my father didn't fish. He golfed." Mr. Sanders nodded his head. Then he said, "Jason, you should take your son fishing. You have a son, don't you?" "Sir, Jason Jr. He's 8. Mr. Sanders stood up and walked over to the large-scale model of the factory complex. He stood there staring at it for a few moments. Then he said, "Jason, I've decided to make a few changes in the plans." Jason said, "Changes? What changes?" Mr. Sanders put his hand on Jason's shoulder. "Don't get upset, Jason. It's bad for your digestion. We're going to relocate the factory complex." He looked at the 2 other executives and said, "Tomorrow I want you to find another piece of property." Everyone around the table sat in stunned silence. They had never seen Mr. Sanders act so irrational. Then Mr. Sanders ordered Jason to take the rest of the day off and go fishing with his son. As Mr. Sanders was checking, he pulled a handful of brightly colored lollipops out of his suit coat pocket. He tossed them on the table and said, "Here, enjoy yourself." Out on the street, Mr. Sanders stopped in front of the sleepy man on the sidewalk. He unfolded a new quilt and covered the homeless man's legs. When the old man opened his eyes, Mr. Sanders handed him a bag of lollipops. Together they tore the cellophane from the lollipops and stuck them in their mouths. Wordlessly, the old man nodded, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. Mr. Sanders smiled and headed toward the sound of the drumming coming from 15th Street. That day, when Jesus looked up in the sycamore tree, he didn't see a Roman tax collector or collaborator. Jesus didn't see an unclean man who was hated as an outcast by everyone else. Jesus looked up and saw a man of faith, a person who truly wanted to change his life. Someone remarked that part of Zacchaeus, once 2 sizes too small, grew 3 sizes that day, sort of like the Grinch. Remember him? God reminded Habakkuk and the people of Judah that the world is not hopeless. Have faith. Eventually, the world will be made right. So now, I'd like you to take a look at the picture of the sycamore tree. This particular sycamore tree stands in the center of Jericho. And I've seen it, as a matter of fact. And I think I took that picture. Anyway, according to the story, it is located in the exact place where Jesus spotted our friend Zacchaeus. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to read to you a reflection piece that was written by Maren Tirabassi, who is an author in the United Church of Christ pastor. She writes this from the point of view of the tree. How it must have been for that traditional wayside tree, tall and with leaves like hearts and figs near the trunk. The tree had seen many passing on the road through Jericho, the soldiers of Rome and pilgrims for the festivals. The rich and poor, those who preyed on the poor, tax collectors and robbers, priests and Levites, and a few who cared for the wounded and the lost. Some good Samaritans, also Jesus, and those who tried to follow. The tree had waited long to be itself a point of view. Somewhere a person could climb to see hope, walk by a fork of wood and bark high enough